So, good evening, dear ladies and gentlemen. I'm really glad that you came here despite this gorgeous weather outside. I welcome you warmly to our panel discussion and study presentation, Ethiopia's Green Deal, an African model for low carbon development. My name is Martina Neuwirth. I'm working on international finance and economy issues at the Vienna Institute for International Dialogue and Cooperation, the VIDC. And for all of you who do not know the VIDC is, as we call it, a think, a do tank, and was founded 60 years ago. And this is really a joyful anniversary that we will celebrate in September. So let me first welcome our dear panelists, Mahlet Eyassu Melkie, who came from Paris to join us. Welcome. I think you can. Nafkote Dabi, who took all the way from London. Welcome.
Thank you.
And Valentine Chukwu from Enugu in Nigeria, who is joining us by Zoom. Hi. Welcome too.
Thank you.
Our discussion will also be shown on Facebook. So my welcome also goes to the participants in Facebook. And of course, you can also ask questions via Facebook. And of course, these questions will also be forwarded to our dear moderator. So let me first thank my colleagues at the VIDC for supporting me with the organization of this event, especially Irene Huchauer-Poda, Magda Seewald, and Mael Nausner. I also want to thank the Austrian Development Agency for its financial support of this event. Our discussion will end at about 8 o'clock, but before you leave, please fill out a very short survey so that you can tell us what you liked, what you didn't like, what we could make better the next time. And I think you might have found the questionnaire already on your seat. Now coming to the subject of this evening, I think because of the war in Ukraine, the problem of global warming has not really disappeared, but it has a bit sidestepped. It was a bit pushed into the background from international headlines. But of course, the problem has not disappeared at all, and it becomes, on the contrary, increasingly urgent. At the end of February, the UN once again called on all states, to do much more than they have done so far to ensure that global warming does not rise above 1.5 degrees. But of course, there are differences between countries, we know that. Poor countries, and I would also say poor people, contribute far less to global warming. On the other hand, the effects of global warming are more felt in low-income countries, especially in Africa. And in fact, as we speak, people in Ethiopia are again actually suffering from a severe drought in the southern and eastern regions, affecting more than 8 million people, according to UN estimates. So it is quite clear that our fossil fuel economic system has reached its limits. The economy of the 21st century must be more mentally sustainable, and it must produce fewer emissions. For poorer countries, it can be an opportunity to follow a green development path without repeating all the mistakes of the rich industrialized countries. And when I say industrialized countries, the term industrialized countries implies industrial policy does play an important role for a green transition. So this is why we at the VIDC already organized an interesting event back in last December, which dealt exclusively with green industrialization in Africa. In parallel, we commissioned Mahlet to conduct a study to take a closer look at the industrialization part of Ethiopia's Green Deal. And this is the study, yippee, it's out. The Green Deal is officially called the Climate Resilient Green Economy Strategy, and it was already introduced more than 10 years ago. Ethiopia has been in the headlines, we also have to say, for more than a year, mainly because of the ongoing civil war. The VIDC, in cooperation with the Bruno Kreisky Forum, already dealt with this conflict in a public event in April. So that is not what we are dealing today. Today, we want to look at the results of the study that Mahlet will present to us. So what does a country like Ethiopia, that hardly produces any emissions itself, produce such a program like the Green Deal? How has the Green Deal been implemented, especially in the industrial sector? Secondly, we will look at the regional level. What regional and international environment can thrive such Green Deals? Are there other green economy strategies and inspiration examples in other countries in Africa? And finally, we will look at inequality, which is also a very important aspect in between countries and also at the international level. So how does climate change add to the persistent inequalities in and between countries? What kind of international climate action should be taken, especially from the global north, to avoid new climate injustices? These and other questions will be addressed by Karin Fischer, who is our moderator this evening. Welcome, Karin, too. Let me finally introduce her. Karin is a VIDC consultant, and she's also the head of the Global Sociology and Development Research Unit at the Institute of Sociology at the Johannes Kepler University in Linz. So I wish us a very interesting debate. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Martina. It's my pleasure to welcome you all, our distinguished guest on the podium, our electronic guest, whom you will see in a minute or two, and of course you here on the spot and our audience in the internet. Thank you for coming. The central topic of today's panel discussion is, as Martina said, the green resilience strategy of Ethiopia. And in a second round, we will broaden the scope and discuss other examples of green transitions on the African continent against the Ethiopian example, and then we will upscale the discussion to the international level and discuss global inequalities, global ecological and social inequalities, and how to deal with this in terms of North and South divide. So we will hear three inline presentations, and then we will open the floor to you, to the audience, also to the audience on the internet. Maël will report the questions of the Facebook viewers, so please write down your questions in the commentary section. Thank you. And we will, as Martina said, we will end at 8 o'clock sharp. So this is as far as the organization of the podium, of the panel discussion is concerned. And now let me introduce our first speaker. Mahlet has conducted the study on Ethiopia. Ethiopia is among the world's top 10 countries with the lowest CO2 emissions per capita. So what was the motivation to start a Green Deal? What were successes, but also drawbacks? That is the subject that was tackled in her study. And Mahlet Eyassu Melkie is an expert on national climate change, adaptation and mitigation policy in Ethiopia. But in addition, she's also an expert in climate finance and has extensive experience on the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And she's also concerned with the governance and work of the Green Climate Fund, right? And the Green Climate Fund, as you might know, is an important element of the Paris Agreement. It is a kind of global platform mandated to support countries and vulnerable societies in the global south adapt to the impacts of climate change. Mahlet has a bachelor degree in sociology and social administration, as well as a master's degree in environment and development from Addis Ababa University, from Ethiopia. And she obtained her second master on climate and society at Columbia University, New York. So we are delighted that you made the way from Paris to us, and the floor is yours. Please start your presentation.
Okay. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. and thank you for coming here and those following us online. So does it show?
Here we go.
Okay. Okay, thank you for the introductions. And yeah, so my study will focuses on the green industrialization in Ethiopia, but for today's presentation, I'll be mostly focusing on the challenge and opportunities and what kind of conclusion do we draw from this process. So maybe for those of you who do not know much about Ethiopia, just to give you a small short intro, it's a landlocked country, it's a less developed country, meaning it has not industrialized and the emissions are very minimum. And yeah, the historical contribution to the global emission is very low. And so far, I mean, at the moment, the population is around 120 million people. And Ethiopia is one of the most vulnerable countries as well when it comes to climate change and has already experienced climate change and with like recurring drought and which is also impacting the people and also the economy. And Ethiopia has a great potential or like various natural resources and also very rich in biodiversity. However, land degradation is a very big challenge and also biodiversity has been affected. So what is the motivation behind developing this Green Deal, which in Ethiopia we call it the climate resilient green economy? So the country was already facing the effects of climate change and also the different projections or the economic assessments were showing that if Ethiopia continues with business as usual, it will only result in racking more debt, international debt. Something had to be done. And also looking at what are the natural assets or the resources in the country and looking at the huge carbon potential, meaning what are like the renewable energy. Ethiopia has like high potential for hydro, solar, wind, geothermal, and taking this into consideration, and also really understanding the co-benefits. If the country goes green, what kind of co-benefits will be brought about is one of the main things that drive this developing this green economy, and also really seeing the potential and opportunity of accessing climate finance and also carbon finance, which will help the country to move towards development. And also really Ethiopia to be well positioned in the region, meaning in Africa and also internationally when it comes to climate discourse. And I should also mention that this was done at a very high level engagement from the government. So how did it came about? So it was launched in 2011 during the Durban Climate Conference. And so one of the main, or the vision of this deal is to build a middle income climate resilient economy by 2025 through a net zero carbon growth. So that was the main part of this climate strategy. So there were about 150 initiatives that were identified, but later on, based on 4 criteria, it was shortlisted to 60 initiatives that focuses on agriculture, the sectors agriculture, forestry, power, transport, and industry. So the 4 pillars of the green economy are the first, improving crop and livestock production while reducing emissions. Second, protecting and reestablishing the forests so that it will serve as carbon sink. And also expanding electricity generation from renewable energy and leapfrogging to modern and efficient energy efficient technologies. So looking in this figure that you see, almost like 85% of the greenhouse gas emissions when this study, this strategy was being developed, that is before 2011, was coming from forestry and agriculture. And you see that from the agriculture, livestock takes the highest share, that is 43%, and followed by forestry. And if you see the other sectors like power, transport, industry, and others, they're almost like less than 3%. So you can see where the highest emission is coming from. And so when this strategy was developed, so the greenhouse gas emission of the country was 150 metric ton of CO2 equivalent per year. So if the country continues to move business as usual, it will go up to 400 metric ton by 2030. So the plan was for the country to continue to develop and also become middle income by 2025, but somehow maintain this emission to 150 metric ton. So looking at the success of this design or the process, like I mentioned earlier, a very high level engagement or buy-in at the Prime Minister level. So it was also designed by this government institution under the IDRI, which is the Ethiopian Development and Research Institute, that was accountable or reporting to the Prime Minister's office. And also through this design, there was an interministerial steering committee that was consulting on these issues, and also a very good outcome, I should say, in this developing the strategy was a climate resilient green economy facility was also established. This is an innovative funding mechanism that is administered by the Minister of Finance, meaning where the fund comes in and which will be administered by the Minister of Finance. And also all these processes, the high buy-in by the government and also this facility, it helped the donor community to have a coordinated or streamlined work when it comes to climate change. And also following up to this, climate change was mainstreamed into the National Development Plan, which is called the Growth and Transformation Plan, the second one. So this was from 2015 to 2020, and now the country has a 10-year development plan. So this was also informed by the CRG and also the Growth and Transformation Plan that has mainstreamed climate change. And just to give you a figure, how here it shows how the different ministries work together and, reporting and working with the technical committee, and the technical committee that reports to the steering committee, and that also goes to the Prime Minister. So when it comes to the implementation and the institutional setup, one good thing that came about is from the strategy, the CRGE units were established in each of the ministries, the responsible ministries, and focal points or individuals were responsible to see this. And as I mentioned earlier, the Minister of Finance was taking the lead in coordinating or managing the funds. And later on, just to fast track and also do kind of a pilot program of this, the CRG fast track investment was done, and this was funded by the UK government and the Austrian Development Agency. And by 2014, 23 fast-track investments were identified and they were funded. And like Martina said earlier, also this plan came about 10 years ago. And now, after 10 years, the government took an independent review of the impact of CRGE to see where the progress is and to assess performance after 10 years. And one of the main findings of this, even if there is this very high political buy-in and a political engagement, it really requires for the plans or the strategy to be translated into action and also being funded. So like I said, when the source of funding, when this was designed, is to see the difference, it could be from carbon or the big international or multilateral funds, also the private investment, and also from development assistance. And also those who will be implementing were identified from the local level to the regional and also the federal level, including the ministries, the civil society, and others. And like I mentioned at the beginning, the study focuses on the industry sector, and you can see here the different policies or strategies that the country has designed when it comes to industrialization. And Martina has also earlier mentioned, for example, the country had in 2019 designed a green manufacturing strategy and also a roadmap seeing the greening of the Ethiopian industrial parks. So looking at the industry sector, just as I mentioned earlier, the industry sector's potential of emission was only 3%. However, the industry sector was seen to be a potential for it to grow if the country wants to develop its GDP for more than 10% per year. And by 2025, the industry was expected to contribute 32% of the GDP of the country. And also another focus is also to accelerate industrialization and increase access to infrastructure through improving the construction sector. And from 2010 to 2030, an increase of 15% emission from the industrial sector was expected. And as I mentioned earlier, the 4 megaton CO2 equivalent, that was like the 3%, will grow to 71 by 2030. So the reason I mentioned here is just to see if the country actually implements all of this. It's expected that the emission will grow very high, but also the country was designing all these policies that will actually take this into consideration while greening the industrial sector. So when coming to the opportunities and the challenge, I want to start with the opportunity. So the CRG, meaning the Green Plan, it actually informed the nationally determined contribution. This is a plan that countries were expected from the Paris Agreement to submit at the UN level to the Climate Convention. So the CRG was the one that actually informed the NDC. And also the CRG facility that was established because of this Green Deal. It offers a good opportunity for the country to access or channel different international, national, public, and also private financing. And Karin has also mentioned that the Minister of Finance is accredited by the Green Climate Fund. Green Climate Fund is one of the multilateral climate, the only climate focused fund that is like a large climate fund. So the Minister of Finance now could access funding directly from the Green Climate Fund. It's due to the process of having this facility in place that it was able to access this. And also the Minister of Finance has attempted to have this methodology to track all the climate expenditures in the country. And since 2011, several initiatives and projects have been implemented, and also various investment opportunities were created for the public and the private sector. And this, the NDC, which is informed by the CRG, it also offers investment opportunities to both small and big investors. When coming to the challenge, the main focus or the main challenge is the means of implementation. The first one is finance needs. So Ethiopia, if it plans to implement all what is there in the Green Plan or the strategy, and also what is in the NDC, it's really highly dependent on international support. And the NDC, there was a first NDC that was submitted in 2015, and an updated one was submitted in 2021. So that actually estimated a budget of 316 billion that is needed to undertake or to implement all the plans that is there. And 20% of that was estimated to be covered by domestic national budget. But the 80%, which is the highest share, is expected to be mobilized from international sources. And also the CRG units that I mentioned, which are established and sit in the different sectoral ministries, they lack financial resources to carry out more and also comprehensive activities. And looking at the capacity needs, there is a high turnover of civil servants in the different ministries, and also multiple restructuring contribute to the problem. For example, if we talk about the Ministry of Environment, which was a ministry back when the strategy was designed, has had different restructuring, and now it's an environment authority. So this actually contributes to this problem. And also fragmentation of government resources policies and activities remains a challenge, and also the limited capacity of the country in developing funding proposals that actually meets mainly the international climate funds. This doesn't mean that there is no capacity, but however, the big international climate funds, their application processes are very rigorous and very complex for countries to be able to, for small countries like Ethiopia, to be able to meet those standards and access funding. And also the CRG registry, that is a web-based platform that was supposed to collect data from the local and federal levels. There was a difficulty in running that because internet and also power coverage in different parts of the country is very minimum, so that actually could not move forward. And also the lack of clarity on who should be taking the lead. Are we expecting only the government to do this, or also what are the policy instruments that should be in place for others to take action is also one of the problems. And the main challenge is also, which I mentioned earlier, in doing this, the 10-year, just looking at what progress has been achieved, the challenge of translating the list of initiatives in the green strategy into actions is a main problem. So in conclusion, a sustained, strong political will towards sustainable development is important, but also it should be coupled with creating confidence for investors by creating consistent and long-standing policies and avoiding erratic change. And also leapfrogging to ensure the country follows the latest available science and technology is important. And Ethiopia to continue its leadership in international development and climate talks, to put pressure on countries who have this historical responsibilities for the global emissions and mobilize resources for climate actions. And it's very important to link the international commitment to national implementation, meaning translating the commitments into investment plans, projects, and programs. And also ensuring that the systems in place actually complement each other to ensure there is a holistic implementation, and also increase the public awareness to establish a whole of society approach for an inclusive engagement approach. And also having this collaboration with the private sector, meaning having the enabling environment for the private sector to be engaged and also help the country in moving towards this middle income vision. And also, which is the main thing, which I mentioned as a challenge as well, the availability of means of implementation in capacity form and also in financial form is very critical for effective transition. Yeah, that's it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahlet, for this instructive summary, at the same time pointing to crucial challenges and opportunities. I'm sure many questions arise at that point, but due to technical reasons, we decided to have the three presentations in line. Otherwise, it's getting too complicated. So we will have our second speaker now, Valentine Chukwu. He will present or discuss other examples, other strategies, green transition strategies on the African continent. Valentine is a consultant and a fellow of the Institute of Development Research of Dataville Group. Dataville Research is a public policy think tank with a head office in Abuja, Nigeria, and other offices, field offices in Joburg and Lagos and Nairobi, among others. The think tank employs global development professionals who work together with local government agencies, with international aid agencies and local groups to develop policy recommendations, above all in non-profit sectors like health and education, but also in conflict resolution. Valentine Chukwu has a bachelor's and a master's degree in forest resources management from the University of Ibadan in Nigeria. So his field of expertise is forest degradation, as well as nature and community-based solutions for deforestation. Valentine worked for the African Heritage Institution and Rich Flood International, which is a company, an environmental company in Abuja, which offers environmental trainings, monitoring, and impact assessments. So he is a practitioner, a well-informed practitioner, and Valentine, I hope you can be seen in a minute on the screen. And please tell us a little bit from your experiences on the floor in Rwanda, in Nigeria, or elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me to this all-important dialogue. To begin with, I will be presenting examples of African countries that have made progress in driving the green industrialization in Africa. And I must note that some African countries have made progress while others are just starting out. And it is after the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development that most African countries recognize that green economy is a means to achieving sustainable development. And at that time, began to develop strategies and integrate into national plans, for implementation. And some of these countries that started early include Ethiopia, that has just been discussed by Mahlet, and Kenya, Mozambique, Rwanda, Senegal, South Africa, and Tunisia. And then I must know that according to the International Energy Agency, Africa has almost about 388 policy frameworks designed to cut emissions and drive green industrialization in Africa. And some of the examples of key sectors that are doing well in some of these African countries include the National Cleaner Production Centers and the leather industry of Uganda, the Ghana Timber Value Chain, agri-business in Cote d'Ivoire, biofuels in Malawi, solar energy in Rwanda and Morocco, geothermal energy in Kenya, trade-offs and choice of energy in Nigeria. But taking Rwanda and Kenya as an example, and importantly, taking a look at the energy sector as a building block of industrialization. So I will take a look at what is the state earlier, what is the motivation, and what the strategy is, and a brief on what the successes have been, then that will be it. Taking Rwanda, for instance, as Rwanda at the beginning, before the adoption of green growth strategy, employs about 4% of the national workforce and contributes about 14% to GDP. And this is half of what comes from the construction sector. And prior to this, the country has experienced an uncertain socioeconomic development issues, growing population issues, vulnerable to climate change, which is common in most African countries, low tax revenues, narrow export base, and limited infrastructure. This is what led the government of Rwanda to embark on programs of mobilizing private investments to transform the industries in the country. And in adopting the green growth strategy, Rwanda tagged it Rwanda Green Growth and Climate Resilience, National Strategy for Climate Change and Low Carbon Development. And this is to run from 2011 to 2050. And the vision is to make the country a developed, climate resilient, low carbon economy by 2050, with the objectives of ensuring that the country achieves energy security and low carbon energy supply, achieves sustainable land use and water resources management, while ensuring social protection, improved health, and disaster risk reduction. Fast forward, there are common thing about Africa's economic system is that it's sector specific. And Rwanda has made much progress in some areas, but I particularly would like to mention the finance area, and which is the highest point of its agenda in driving a green growth industrialization. And that's the creation of Rwanda's Fund for Environment and Climate Change for managing climate finance. In 2013, this particular FONEWA, which is the Fund for Environment and Climate Change, obtained financing from the British International Climate Fund to the value of £222.5 million. And this, was the largest demand-based climate fund in Africa. And one of the progress they made was to move electricity supply or access to electricity from 6% in 2008 to 46.6%. It is evident that the economic growth now averages 8% per year. And according to the World Health Organization, this has, this green growth drive, industrialization has led to fall in inequality in the country, reduction in absolute poverty, an increase in life expectancy from 43% to 64%. Then, about 10 years afterwards, the country decided to review what they've done so far. And this took place around they observed that somehow the green growth agenda does not properly align with the development agenda of the country. And as such, it is imperative that they align both so that there won't be incoherence in the policy implementations. And some of the issues that the country raised was that they want to be specific about the targets they want to achieve by 2050. And some of these targets included targets of irrigation. Also, it's important to know that one of the challenges that some African countries face, and especially Rwanda, is that costs were not used for intended planning purposes. And the issue of prioritization, as well as the issue of inadequate capacity, which Mahlet cited. And moving over to Kenya's case, Kenya also is doing well, like Rwanda, but in Kenya's case, the population is a major driver of negative environmental issues. And poverty as of 2006 was so high, 46.9%. And then the country's gross domestic product half of it comes from natural resources. More than half of the Kenyan household depend on agricultural activities for their livelihood. And this is to give you a picture of how vulnerable the country is. And that this is the motivation for the government to, push for adoption of green industrialization strategies as a blueprint to transition the economy to what they dream it to be. And the Kenya government tags its strategy, Green Economy Strategy and Implementation Plan, GESIP, and which began around 2015. And the objective of this is to transition to a green, low carbon and climate resilient economy. It is observed that climate scenario analysis of the strategy delivers a higher benefit compared to a higher and stable growth compared to business as usual. But I must note that in Kenya, one key thing that helped in the successes they achieved is the harmony between the vision, the green growth vision, and the country's constitution, and by extension, the development agenda in promoting infrastructure investment and sustainable livelihoods. So, and what works for the country is adoption of inclusive and participatory approach in its dealings. And some of the achievements, especially with respect to the energy sector, is Kenya becoming a geothermal leader and a model for Africa. Research has shown that 90% of Kenya's energy generated from Kenya come from clean sources, including geothermal, hydro, solar, and wind. And the country has improved access to electricity from 19.2% in 2010 to 21.4% in 2020, and this is according to World Bank. There's also increased geothermal power supply from 10% in 2004 to 50% in 2020, and this is something commendable. Geothermal electricity production has lowered cost of power to 22%, and thus in 2019, Kenya was ranked one of the top 7 geothermal powerhouses in the world. But while these two countries have made progress, I must note that there are some other areas they've also made progress. And for time consciousness sake, I will limit the discussion on this, but I must not forget to mention that most countries in Africa, especially the two I mentioned, have faced limited technical capacity issues, and this will linger for a long time until that gap is going to be filled. There's also the financial challenges in implementing green growth agenda, and this will depend on foreign support. The coordination with different stakeholders and government agencies is a big issue, as well as institutional strength. But also prioritization is very, very key. And thus, African governments need strong leadership that is with credible long-term plans that can translate into a broad vision and into strategies and policies into actions, and establish strong regulatory standards and set inception incentives that will remove barriers to green growth and also create conducive environment for industrialization activities. But it's also important to decentralize pattern of economic innovation, because it is more shock resilient than having a large project concentrated in one part in a particular place. So the strength of government institutions must also extend to the regional and international environmental governance. And the African government must also ensure that monitoring and evaluation is part and parcel of every agenda implementation, green growth agenda implementation, because this is very key to know how policy advance the industrialization. It is also important for them to prioritize public spending and investment areas that stimulate and incentivize sustainability in all sectors. And just to quickly mention that it is also African leaders consider using tax and market-based tools to stimulate green innovation and investments. And that's that for the two countries I wish to give us as an example. But I am also use Nigeria as a country that is oil dependent and is also struggling with driving green industrialization. Nigeria is a wonderful nation, blessed, but is also faced with climate change issues. For instance, in 2018 alone, flooding in Nigeria affected about 12 states, 300,000 people, and 60 hectares of farmland. And there's also poverty rising in Nigeria. It is really not going down, and which is a source for concern, because most African countries recorded economic growth, or there's improving macroeconomic trends and foreign direct investments. But this has not really benefited the African livelihoods, the majority of the people. And this is one of the reasons poverty has been rising. And this is why the promise in green industrialization is social equity, social inclusion and equity. So Nigerian case, the poverty is rising, and that is why World Bank projected that by this Nigeria recognized the potential in green industrialization, and is struggling to also make efforts towards planning and making policies for climate resilience and low carbon economy. And I must say that Nigeria has also made progress, especially in tracking gas flaring and taxing gas flaring through its Nigeria Gas Flare Commercialization Program. And in 2020, the country partnered with African Development Bank to establish its Circular Economy Working Group to support inclusive growth and efficient resource management. And afterwards, the country drew up regulations, economic policies, which include, among others, the new plastic waste management policies, and importantly, the Economic Sustainability Plan. Moving ahead, last year, the Nigerian Circular Economy Working Group developed 10-year green growth framework for transition to a green economy. And the country tagged towards the development of Nigeria's long-term low-emission development strategy. And the aim of this is to ensure that Nigeria by 2050 becomes a country of low carbon, climate resilient, high growth circular economy that reduces its level of emissions by 2050 by 50%, reduces its current level of emissions by 50%, moving towards net zero emissions across all sectors of its development in gender responsive manner. But it must also be noted that achieving this Agenda 2050 is dependent upon meeting the nationally determined contributions, which is also dependent on the resources that comes, from the developed countries. So, and it is Nigeria's will be needing by 2030 about $177 billion for its implementation and for achieving this promise to contribution to the Paris Agreement. So Nigeria, but in Nigeria achieving this strategy, why I must comment that efforts are being made to key Nigeria into this green industrialization. I must also note that there are so many challenges that the country will have to face, especially because of its oil dependence or dependence, on oil as a mainstay of its revenue. And petrol subsidy is a very big issue in the sense that is not really contributing or pushing forward the drive for green industrialization. Nigeria recently increased its petrol subsidy from 349.42% in 3 years and now spent almost about 4 trillion naira on petrol subsidy. So while petrol subsidy may help cushion the price tension or the price issues consumers may have, it comes with a high fiscal cost, higher taxes and higher borrowing, but less spending. And there's also the issue of inefficient allocation of economic resources. It could encourage pollution. And this is all we're talking about, contributing to climate change issues. And it doesn't really target the poor, and is a very big issue. So removing fuel subsidy is very, very important. But efforts to remove fuel subsidy has been met with lack of public support and has led to unrest and in some cases injuries and death. So it is important that the government designs a comprehensive energy sector reform plan with, importantly, transparent and extensive communication, because there's this gap between government policy implementation and what the people hears and understands about what the government is doing. And achieving this must be backed by policies that protect the poor, because this will help to push the reform forward. And importantly, while it is good to make policies, it is good to back a political will. So that in the end, what is designed to achieve be achieved. Thank you so much.
Thank you. As I said, you will have the opportunity to comment or respond to each other. But before that, we address the subject of climate injustice As we have heard in the beginning, poor countries and poor people contribute far less to global warming, but the effects of global warming are much more felt in poor countries, in low-income countries, especially in Africa, where people already die from climate change-induced disasters, as we have heard. So in the face of common but differentiated responsibilities, what are appropriate strategies to tackle climate emergency in the global north and in the global south? And for that subject, we have Nafkote Dabi with us today. She is the climate change policy lead of Oxfam in London, based in London. She has worked with international organizations across Africa in various roles, including as food security advisor in South Sudan. She was the regional policy lead for the Lake Chad Basin based in Nigeria, senior policy officer on peace, security and governance at the African Union liaison office in Addis Ababa, and the drought policy advisor in Ethiopia. So she has also experience in Ethiopia. Nafkote has a master's degree in international social and public policy from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and a bachelor's degree in cultural anthropology from the Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts in the US. So the floor is yours for your presentation on global inequalities and climate change. You can do it from here, or do you want to change seat?
It might be easier to see.
Okay.
Actually, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Really happy to be part of this discussion. Sorry, maybe I can do this. It's fine. So I'm going to tell a very simple story. I think, it's really important to talk about climate change and to give a simple narrative. So for the next 15 minutes, I'll be talking about climate inequality and climate negotiation. Under climate inequality, I'll cover 3 areas: inequality in emissions, inequality in impact, and inequality in response and recovery. And under climate negotiation, I will touch upon mitigation and climate finance for adaptation, for mitigation, and loss and damage. So the climate crisis is about inequality and injustice. There's huge inequality in emissions, and it's important to understand this and assign responsibility so that we can address the climate crisis in a just and fair way. We are not all equally responsible for the climate crisis. We all like to think, we're under this crisis together, but it's really important to understand that we are not all equally responsible for the climate crisis. It's the richest people and the richest countries that are responsible or largely responsible for the climate crisis. If we look at global north countries, they're responsible for 92% of excess emissions and for 92% of climate damages. And if we look at per capita emissions, and I think this is an important measure to understand better inequality within countries and between countries, then we see that the richest people are largely responsible for the climate crisis. So the richest 1% alone are responsible for double the carbon emissions of the poorest 50%. And when we're talking about the poorest 50%, we're talking about, half of humanity. And to put this inequality in perspective, let's compare, Austria's per capita emission with Ethiopia's. Austria, the average Austrian emits 8 tons per year, and the average Ethiopian emits 0.1 tons of carbon per year. So the per capita emissions of an average Austrian is 80 times over than the per capita emissions of an average Ethiopian. Impact inequality. Again, we all like to think we're in this crisis together, but it's important to underline that we are all impacted, but we are not impacted equally. And here I want to give an example of the flood in Germany, I think last year, yeah, 2021. It was a big disaster. But in terms of, economic impact or damages, the damage is estimated to be, equivalent to 0.1% of Germany's GDP. If we look at Dominica, Hurricane Maria in 2017, the hurricane caused a huge damage, an estimated 225% of Dominica's GDP. This is huge. 225 for Dominica, percent of its GDP, and it's a poor country. And Germany is a powerhouse in Europe, and the impact was 0.1% of its GDP. So here we're only talking about economic costs. We're not talking about lives lost or human suffering. And when we do that, I think the picture is even bleaker. So it's the poorest people, those who are least responsible for the climate crisis, that are impacted the most, forced from their homes, forced from their livelihoods. It's also women, people of color, indigenous communities, those who are historically marginalized, that are hugely impacted by the climate crisis. There's also inequality in the way we respond to the crisis, the way we address, the way we try to adapt to the crisis. We all don't have the same capacity to respond in terms of, technical and financial capacity. Finance is required to adapt to a changing climate, and the science is clear again and again. We're told that the climate is changing and that the impact is going to be worse. So it means we need to adapt, especially poor countries and poor communities need to adapt. So, where is this finance going to come from? Without adequate finance, the climate crisis will increase poverty and inequality. And what's worrying is, the more this crisis occurs, of course, it's going to, erode the capacity of communities further, putting them into further poverty. And the last thing I want to mention, on inequality is that our economic system is killing people and the planet. And when we're talking about the economic system here, it's about the global, dominant neoliberal economic system, and also our carbon-fueled economic system. It's based on endless extraction of resources. It's based on endless pursuit of profit, endless economic growth. So this endless economic growth comes at a cost, at a cost to people and at a cost to our environment. So in order to address the climate crisis, we need to tackle inequality. We need to tackle the emissions of the richest people. We need to tackle emissions of richest countries. So how do we make progress? How do we address this global crisis and promote global action? As we said, the climate crisis is about inequality and injustice. And therefore, climate solutions should be based on justice and fairness. And this idea of justice and fairness is reflected in the UNFCCC, the UN framework, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So there's a principle underlining the UNFCCC called Common but Differentiated Responsibilities and Respective Capabilities. So there's a recognition that rich countries are, largely responsible for global emissions and for the crisis. There's also the recognition that developed countries have, a much better capacity in terms of finance and technical capacity, so that they can adapt, so that they can respond to the crisis. And within climate negotiation, there's mitigation and climate finance that are the two important areas. And under mitigation, all countries are required to reduce emissions and limit warming to 2 degrees centigrade, or ideally to 1.5 degrees centigrade. Even poor countries who have contributed least to the climate crisis are expected to reduce emissions and contribute to global climate action. There are important questions that need to be addressed on mitigation and climate finance to make climate solutions just and fair. So who needs to cut first and most in terms of emissions? Rich countries and the richest people should be the first to cut emissions. There's also the question of, who should use the remaining carbon budget. We have a limited carbon budget, to ensure that we don't overpass global warming over 1.5. Poor countries have the right to develop. They have the right to lift their people out of poverty. So this remaining carbon budget should be used to tackle poverty, to address poverty. And if we require poor countries who have contributed least to global emissions, such as Ethiopia, then who's going to finance their transition to to low carbon economy? And huge finance is required to do this, as we have seen in the case study that Mahlet did. Just Ethiopia, one country, requires 300 billion over 10 years. This is huge money, and we're just talking about one developing or poor country. And Ethiopia has contributed least to global emissions. So developed countries should finance this. They are largely responsible to global emissions. But what's the state of climate finance? So developed countries have agreed to provide $100 billion per year starting 2020 to developing countries, but they haven't even met this goal. And we're in 2022. This money hasn't been delivered. And this money, the 100 billion, is both for mitigation and adaptation. And again, the Ethiopia case study, 300 billion for one country is required. So huge finance is required to transition to low carbon economy. So similar to mitigation, who's going to finance developing countries to adapt? Again, climate is changing. We need to adapt. Who's going to finance developing or poor countries to adapt to changing climate? And a really critical question that is being debated right now is the issue of loss and damage. Who's going to finance the damages and losses experienced by poor countries? As we're speaking right now, millions of people in the Horn of Africa are experiencing drought. Pastoralist communities have lost tens of millions of their livestock, 60 to 70% of their cattle, and I think this is a conservative estimate. So lives are being lost, they're losing their income and livelihood, they're using their ways of life, and who's going to finance these losses and damages that they're experiencing? And Somalia, Ethiopia, they contributed the least, again, to global emissions and to the climate crisis. So climate finance is really critical, and these questions need to be answered. Thank you so much.
You might stay here. Okay, let's stay here, like we are. Thank you very much. Well, the floor is open to your questions. You can, of course, comment on each other, but at first sight, I will have a look at the audience if some questions arise or hands go up. There is one question. I would take you two if this is okay. And then we have a second round where you can pick up the question and comment. And Valentine, you give us a sign if you can't understand the questions. And I would repeat it, or we write it down, or try to communicate with you in a way, okay? So this was the first, the gentleman at the back.
Okay, I actually have three questions. I'll begin with the third one, and it's for, sorry, just a minute. I have to get the name right. Mahlet. Yes, please. To what extent does the military conflict in Ethiopia interfere with the fulfillment of the goals of the project that you outlined? That's question number 3. Question number 2 is, have CO2 emissions increased since the project began, or have they decreased? And the first question was, to what extent are local communities fully involved in the process, rather than the hierarchy?
Yeah, okay, fine. Let's gather and let's collect questions, and the gentleman, beside.
So I think I would have 3 questions, but one for everyone. So for Mahlet, my understanding is while you started the project, the population of Ethiopia should be around 85 million then, back in 2010. Was it accounted for the population growth that is expected while making this strategy somehow? And I expect from what I know, the population should still increase. Has there been like a readjustment into the strategy based off that? I'm coming from Nigeria, I understand that. Secondly, that would be for Valentine. Regarding the issues with subsidies and all of that, what do you expect from, because I think there's been a lot of investment into looking inwards to refineries. I don't know if that helps the CO2 cost or not, because I'm not sure the Nigerian government are really interested so much in that situation right now. So it would be nice to have a clarification in that. And finally, I'm not sure how to pronounce your name, so pardon me.
Nafkote.
It's interesting a little bit for me when we think about the fact that, okay, the African continent did not contribute at all to this, or not so much to this, and it's the Europeans, and coming from the first industrial revolution, basically, the speed at which the CO2 increased from that point till now. My question is, when you look back at the regular people, just normal average people, they want what the Europeans are living. They want the train, they want the electricity, they want the cool things, the phones and all of that. How do you convince them that we want to take a different path, but not that same way? For me, I think it's probably the biggest issue in the African space. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You took down the questions, so that was a lot about the Ethiopian strategy. Maybe we start with that? Yeah?
Sure. Okay, maybe I'll start from the last question and go up. So I think with the population, you're right. But I think one thing which will probably answer to your first question, sorry I didn't get your name, is, okay, so when this strategy was designed, it was like 2011, and all the data and everything was taken before that, including the population, the CO2 emissions, and all of that. But the good thing is, like, the climate strategy is embedded in the National Development Plan, and also the NDC, which is the Nationally Determined Contribution that is submitted to the UNFCCC, is also on the basis of that. So, for example, one thing interesting is also the NDC, which was updated and submitted in 2011, also incorporated another methodology, and actually saw that the emissions were higher than which was estimated in 2011. It was not only 150, but it was more than 200 metric tons of CO2. So that was kind of, in a way, corrected in the new plan, I would say. And also, I would say it's very difficult for me to say at this point whether emissions have increased or decreased, but I would expect that it has increased to some extent, because all the plans that is actually in the CRG is not implemented, which was envisioned to reduce these emissions. And like I mentioned, all the industrial sector and everything was developing, and especially the construction sector was booming a lot. So all of this will actually contribute to emissions, but to what extent? I don't think there has been a study to what extent it has increased. But like I mentioned, the baseline is now corrected. It's now more like what we had in 2011, that the emission is increasing. And the other question you had is about to what extent the local communities have been involved or consulted. Like you mentioned, I mentioned earlier as well, this was mostly came from up and going down. But through the process, it was really trying to involve the community at the local level. So even when the implementation was being designed, it was like, yes, it will be coordinated at the federal level, but also there's the regions, and the regional levels also are supposed to go down to the local, like the smallest district, which is a Kabale in Ethiopia, at the Kabale level, and involve them. But like I said, it's very difficult at this point because not most of the projects have been implemented. Yes, there are many that have started being implemented, but yeah, so it's still, I wouldn't say it was 100% locally, involved in the consultation process, but there has been some consultations. And with regards to your first question to the conflict, to what extent it has actually impacted the implementation of this plan, again, we don't have the study yet, but I would say, for example, just one example I could mention. When it comes to the industry sector, there are different industrial parks found in different parts of the country, including in Tigray, including in different parts of like the northern Ethiopia and others. So we assume it has been impacted. And, like, for example, just specific one example when it comes to the industrial sector. And also, of course, the government's priorities shift when it comes to a conflict. When you have a conflict in the country, the prioritization will be on other urgent needs. So I would say the priority has somehow become less when compared to what would have been achieved.
Okay. Valentine, did you understand the question which was going to you on Nigeria? Did you understand the question?
Can you repeat that? Can you repeat that, please? Network was unstable, so I couldn't get the whole question.
No. So we will organize that. And Nafkote, I would ask you to respond to the question. It was about the right to development. You spoke about that. And this question goes to you. And we will organize that in a way. But yeah,
sure. First. Sure. Thanks so much for that question. Oxfam, for instance, when we published the carbon inequality report that really shows inequality in emissions, some of the comments we received from countries, for instance, in Africa is, this is not relevant for us. So that really made me think, what you're struggling with really made me think, because people were saying, hey, we also want to be on the same level, so why are you attacking the rich people? So I think for me, the most important thing is, whether it's in Africa, like developing countries, poor countries have the right to develop. And when it comes to people, having access to internet, having access to schools, having access to hospitals, or, having this kind of concrete buildings, we all need this, and we all need to access that. So we have the right to develop, and we should be on that path. But now when it comes to development, we have an opportunity to not follow the European path and be on a cleaner path to development. So it may not be a good example, but it's like phones. I would assume a lot of people in Europe might have had the landline. For communities in Africa, we may not have had access to landlines, but we skipped that, and now we have, even farmers in countryside, they have the mobile phones, no? So we can how do you say, leapfrog, or I don't know the word, but yeah, we can jump, that we can skip that path and be on a path to cleaner development. And we need to access, we need to develop. As I mentioned before, like if an average Ethiopian, the per capita emission is 0.1, and an average Austrian, the per capita emissions is 8 tons. The Austrian needs to come down. What we're estimating for 2030, for instance, is around 2.3 tons per person. So we have a lot of space for an Ethiopian to go from 0.1 to 2.1 or 2.3, and for the Austrian to come down so that we can be, in the same level of development. So that's why we keep on saying we need to tackle inequality to address the climate crisis, but also to give people the chance, or to give countries the chance to develop and to address poverty. I don't know if I'm answering your question in, the most articulate way, but yeah.
You were asked to write the question to Valentine down. That makes it easier. Is that okay for you? It was about clarifications and Nigeria, but we didn't get it. So he will write it down, Valentine. Wait a second, and we will communicate it to you. In the meantime, Mael will bring in some questions from the commentary section in Facebook.
Yes. Is this working?
Just try.
And this is a comment and question from Miret Kebede Alwabi. Thank you for sharing. What outcome are you expecting from this presentation, and from whom?
From?
Which outcome are you expecting from this presentation, and from whom are you expecting the outcome, I guess?
Do you want to take this question?
No, I think the way I also see this panel discussion is also to first present the findings from the study from the Ethiopian perspective, and also what Valentine has shared with us, the different experiences from Kenya, Rwanda, and also Nigeria, and also Nafkote with her presentation on inequality and justice perspective. I think the main question which we had in the first slide, what is like Africa's low carbon development, what does it look like, and what are the challenges and opportunities out there. So I think at the end of the session, my expectation, at least my personal expectation, is for participants to actually understand what the challenges are really out there for African countries to go green, and also what is needed for these countries to be able to follow the path they have. Like, it's a plan at the moment, but to actually implement this plan, what is out there. And also I think which Nafkote is also bringing is like from the audience here really to understand what this inequality looks like really from the ground level.
And your expectations?
I think it's, for us to be informed, first and foremost, when we're talking about the climate crisis, who's responsible, who's impacted. But even if possible, for us to take action in terms of, I don't know who asked this question, but if, they can mobilize others to take action or to demand from their government what needs to be done, for instance, on climate finance, to write to the Austrian government, you need to support climate finance negotiations, or when it comes to mitigation and what Mahlet was talking about, a transition to low carbon economy, for us to understand the complexity, and at the heart of it, it's about climate finance and it's about justice and how do we go about it. So I don't know, first is, I think, for us to be informed, and I would assume actually a lot of people are informed about this, but also for us to take action in any form.
Thank you for a nice question. I've got yours, Valentine. It's for you. So how does investments into the oil industry and into refineries impact on a green economy strategy in Nigeria? That was the question.
Okay. I must say that one of the areas the government has done so well is investing in refineries, and especially in tracking and tasking gas flaring, which has remained one of the key issues and one of the major sources of emissions in the Nigerian energy sector. Yes, if you listen well, I stated earlier that the government noted that achieving its 2030 targets and Nigeria's contribution to Paris Agreement, the National Development Contribution, is dependent. Achieving the green growth industrialization is dependent upon realizing the targets of 2030 vision, and that is cutting the emissions. And cutting the emissions, lowering carbon has been the major issue. So yes, the investment and the great work the government is doing in the Nigerian energy sector is wonderful. But remember, one of the key issues with African economy is that it's sector specific. So while that is commendable, other sectors seem to be neglected, so to say. Apart from agriculture and mineral extraction, other sectors seem not to receive much attention. And green growth industrialization is not about one sector or two sectors. So we commend the Nigerian government in that area, but other sectors are not receiving the needed attention to also drive in that area. So when that is holistically considered, the attention given to the oil sector should also be replicated in other sectors. Yes, Nigeria is doing well in that regard and is also contributing positively to achieving the green agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. To a second round of questions. There are. Yeah. 1, 2, 3. Somebody on the internet, Mile, or no? Okay. So it was 1, 2, and 3. And up there. So for gender equality, we should go up. But okay, it's fine. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. And another one. Okay.
Yeah, thanks to all speakers. I have a question probably for Mahlet on the industrialization strategy in Ethiopia. So you mentioned that there are like a lot of industrial parks, and if I remember right, in the south of the country, there's also this big eco-industrial park for fashion production. And I was wondering how, from the Ethiopian case, but then also more generally, how we can make sure that, I mean, this green leapfrogging and then also green finance doesn't lead to increased inequalities, because like the research I do is actually points to the fact that often countries, in the case of Ethiopia, they invest in such technologies, but then actually the gains are rather captured by multinational corporations that are integrated into these industries. So I was wondering, what can we also learn that these investments into green industries are not only captured again by actors from the global north. And I think that also links a bit to green finance, where there's also this big critique. I mean, that's a broader critique, but that basically green finance makes a lot of things for investors from the global north investable, and that governments both from the global north, but then also from the global south, invest a lot of money to de-risk the profits of private investors. So how can, I mean, which debates are there to actually change this development, that we don't end up in actually, by wanting to do something good, actually increasing inequality?
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Thank you. That could also be a question to you, talking about uneven vulnerabilities to climate change. So up there, lady up there, yeah.
Hi, thanks for the very interesting presentations. My question ties a bit into what was said before about the oil resources in Nigeria, but also to your question that you posed, Nafkote, about who should use the remaining carbon budget, because the opposite question of that is who should use the remaining extraction budget, which is obviously also a question of inequality and equality. If, say, rich fossil fuel countries like Norway should stop the extraction of fossil fuels, the supply of fossil fuels to give, for example, Nigeria this possibility to extract their natural resources. But on the other hand, there are also economists that argue that countries of the global south could use these fossil fuel deposits that they have to keep them in the ground and make the north pay for it, more or less. So I wanted to ask if, I don't know about the case of Ethiopia, if they are also rich in fossil fuels, but if that is also a topic to restrict the supply of fossil fuels and not only give a better supply in green alternatives.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Then next,
thank you very much for the speakers and the moderation. My question goes a bit in line with this gentleman's question here. I was wondering about questions related to the insertion of Ethiopia in the global economy and terms of unequal exchange. So I imagine, I don't know, but I just Googled quickly about Ethiopia's exports, and I can imagine it's primary export-oriented country, so mostly primary products. But it's just a guess. So could please maybe offer some more details on that. But I also understand that countries that hold this positions like that in the global economy, I'm from Brazil, it has like some similarities in that sense, are often trading goods that are very rich in natural resources, very rich in labor, and trading back from the global north products that have like some technological value, but there's no material value that backs up. So what we have in the end of the day is a transfer of natural resources and transfer of labors from these countries to the global north. So that's how this value is captured somehow through global value chains. And then I wonder if this strategy, if the climate resilience strategy entails any industrialization strategy in the sense of substituting imports or gauging different levels in global supply chains that could change Ethiopia's position in the global economy in a more broad and structural way. So this, I think, is mainly for Mahlet. Thank you so much for your exposition before. And then maybe it's more quick and broad question for Nafkote. When you show us the importance of the emissions of the countries in the global north and the richest populations in comparison to emissions like Ethiopia, and then somehow I wonder if there is a contradiction, if you would see a contradiction in making emissions reduction backbone element in industrial policy or development policy in these least developed countries. Does it make sense at all? Isn't there any other priority goals that should be structuring these plans? And then I would back to my first question, like industrial substituting imports and gauging other positions in global supply chains and so on and so forth. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we are tackling the subject if responses to the climate crisis are also reinforces new inequalities, right? Different aspects were mentioned. That goes to you, Mahlet, but also maybe to you. The last question goes to you. And then we had the subject theme of oil-dependent countries, and maybe this the subject of compensation for leaving resources in the ground. Valentine, did you understand that? Yeah? Because
no.
that could... I'll repeat it afterwards. But you are asked to respond, and then we have the third and last round of questions.
Okay. So I think I have a lot of questions. And yeah, I think maybe just starting from the beginning about the industrial parks and really opening it up for the multinationals and just bringing them. Which maybe I run very quickly in my presentation also in the industry. So the government, like I mentioned, the emission was only 3% from the industry sector, but really seeing also, maybe to respond to your question, really Ethiopia to become more, to export more, not necessarily to import everything, but to be an exporting country, and also to make sure that in doing that, to really make sure there is a lot of manufacturing, meaning to manufacture a lot of things in the country, so to increase or accelerate the manufacturing sector. That is the main aim now that, in the industry strategy that the country has, and also really identifying that potential, the industry sector's potential, how it can do that. But while having that plan and also taking into consideration how we can do it green and how we can actually not repeat the same mistakes that we have seen in other developed countries. So in doing that, and also in designing the industrial parks, and like you said, yes, even when greening the industrial parks is also like a roadmap on how to green them. There's a strategy on that, and looking at how this industrial parks could actually meet the international standards, meaning it's really about attracting those coming from abroad, but also there is a room for that, and also the country sees it from the point of like job creation, and also having all of that, all the scope benefits in the country. So it's not only about, like you said, of course, labor is cheaper, for example, as compared to China or Indonesia, and those multinational or corporations are coming to these countries where labor is cheap. But of course, for like an average or a low-income Ethiopian country who gets to work in these industrial parks, the job opportunity, and which actually replicates or kind of supports the whole family, I mean, the impact is much bigger than just hiring one person, for example. Yes, of course, like I said, also the country is at the same time promoting like manufacturing in the country, not only bringing those from abroad, but also from the country. And the other, yes, so I think I also touched upon your question about this export, and also what I should mention, the country is also challenged with getting foreign currency. That's a major problem that the country has, and the foreign currency reserve is very limited every time. So really trying to get this foreign currency and really making Ethiopia a country that could export a lot of raw materials or resources or even manufactured goods that are out there is also one thing that the country plans to do. And I think maybe I'll let you answer, but I think just for your last question about whether it actually makes sense for an LDC country to come up with this plan, and I mentioned it in my study and also the presentation, and I think really for Ethiopia it was really seen as a potential and as really an opportunity for the country, because I mean the infrastructure, whatever is not there, it can be done in a green and clean way. So when the country was designing this, it was seen from an opportunity perspective and looking at the co-benefits. I mean, we haven't progressed much on these things. We're not stopping what we were necessarily doing, but really going clean and green from the start.
Mm-hmm. I think you had that in your presentation, that climate change efforts often secure privileged population while harming or excluding others that already suffer severely from climate change. I think you had that in your presentation. Do you want to respond to this new or this danger of new inequalities as well?
Yeah, sure. To be honest, something that really bothers me is it's not only about the past, but when we're also talking about climate solutions and some of the discussions taking place within UNFCCC, I don't know in detail about it, like for instance, Article 6, the carbon market and so on. For me, what's being proposed is like offsets, for instance, a rich country, I don't know much about Austria, but let's say Switzerland, for instance, plans to offset and reduce their emissions. But offset will require them to use land, let's say, from Ghana or Peru. So they are reducing their emissions using the lands of, developing countries. That land can be used to produce food or other things. So I find it, really unfair. But yeah, let's see how these negotiations go. And also, I really don't have insight into the country's perspective, for instance, how Peru or Ghana feels about this. But also when we're talking about low carbon economies or transitioning to clean energy, we're talking about like renewable minerals. Where are these minerals coming from? They're still coming from developing countries, no? Like poor countries. So again, human rights violations and environmental degradation and so on. So these are part of climate solutions. And for me, the rich countries are still capitalizing on, poor countries. So it may not be, a direct answer to your question, but in general, like how climate solutions can exacerbate inequality. The extraction budget, first time hearing about it, but really interesting, meaning the phrasing. Like for Oxfam, for instance, what we say is, we're clear in our position that developed countries really need to pull out of, fossil fuels first and fast. But that said, if we're saying we need to limit warming to 1.5, then we're also saying fossil fuels don't have place, yeah? But again, developing countries need to develop. And a country like Guyana, for instance, is, I think, planning to rely a lot on the extraction of I think, oil and gas to develop their economies. So what we're saying is for poor countries, they also need to stop using fossil fuels or rely on the extraction of fossil fuels. But that said, they need a bit of time. And the revenue should be used actually to address poverty. Because there are issues, I don't know, maybe Valentine can say a bit more, like Nigeria, how much of, the extraction of fossil fuels has really benefited communities, those who need to benefit from it. Yeah.
So the last question, Nafkote was addressing Valentine. Could you reconstruct the question behind her answer? It was about oil exporting countries, export-dependent countries, compensation for, should be oil exporting countries in Africa banned from using its own resources for development or not, and how should they react? And there was the question of compensation, right? So this is it. What do you think about that?
The network is unstable, but I think I get an idea of what you're trying to say. No? Hello, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, I said the sole targets of the drive for green industrialization is to limit carbon emissions. Telling African countries not to extract their mineral resources is not the way forward. Yes, we understand that the way to go is to lower the carbon Nigeria, for instance. I think the government is doing not can really be no, but at least it's doing well in trying to diversify the economic source, because oil has been the mainstay of the economy, and moving away from agriculture into other areas is a welcome development. But while Africans, as they put to lower.
If you, Valentine, please shut down the video function. Maybe that makes it better, or hopefully will make it better.
I think
because that needs a lot of energy. So,
what I'm trying to say, I'm saying in essence that why must work towards.
No, that doesn't work, does it? No, we can't understand you. I'm very sorry. Just try to shut down the video. So we can't see you, but we might hear you better. Yeah. Okay, so start again.
Okay, I'm saying in essence that Africa cannot be.
No.
What could be encouraged? I mean, with respect to the energy sector, okay? What could be encouraged is the diversification of revenue source and development of the economy, like moving away from reducing the extent of oil exploration and moving into sectors like agriculture and some other areas. But I'm also that.
No, Valentine, that doesn't work. I'm afraid that doesn't work. Give me a sign from you. No, it doesn't work. No. I'm very sorry, Valentine. Yeah, that does not work. I would. We still have 10 to 12 minutes, and you're very patient, and nobody left until now. So I would. I would bring in 2 more questions. You raised your hand, was that right? And that would be your second turn. 3 questions, short answers. Maybe we have to. Yeah, maybe we'll only have 2 panelists left, but let's see. So you were the first one here, yeah? And then the gentleman in the same row, and then we go to the back.
Okay, so I have questions relating to the financing. So one question to you, Mahlet, would be if the Ethiopian government has explained any ideas on the role of the central bank. So in Europe and the US, there's an increasing discussion on the role of the central bank in helping governments transition to a green economy through different channels, right? There's green quantitative easing, taking climate risk specifically into account in their policies, etc. So one question would be if there is any mentioning of this in this green development plan. And the second one was if there's any discussion of or any idea where these international funders would come from. So we know that China has been pushing quite intensely its kind of influence and infrastructure projects, but also financing in Africa, but also in Eastern Africa. So if there's any kind of hint or ideas at the moment to know what the role of China will be, or if there are other potential creditors or financiers that are discussed. And then to you, Nafkote, I'd had a question, because there is a discussion about, again, the role of central banks, or in general governments in the global north, due to their historic responsibility for climate change, to support governments in the global south, for example, through government bond purchases to give countries in the global south liquidity in order to finance various transitioning projects. I was wondering what your opinion was on the issue, and if you could, elaborate a bit on that. Thank you.
Central banks. So the gentleman beside. No, the same row.
I was wondering, Mahlet, do you feel like there's been major shifts in the way industrial policy has been implemented since the beginning of the Abiy administration? Do you feel like it's been more or less continuity, or have there been any major shifts in how it's been conducted, how industrial policy is being implemented, and so on?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And your second question.
Or
third or fourth.
Okay, so my question will probably to Nafkote. In terms of the climate fund, the pocket, I'm worried about the people contributing, using it as a puppet string for African countries. Like, you know how it works in the UN world nations, where when they want to make decisions, they would rather fund the countries that support them for something and all that. Are you any worried that the Europeans or the people in the North would use that to gain friends? Because especially in Africa, where there's a small, it might not be visible to the outside world, there's a small power play between the US and China in terms of putting funds development, especially in a lot of African countries who they don't care where the money is coming from as long as the money is coming in. Do you think that would be a problem going forward? That's it.
Okay. Thank you very much. These are your last answers, so please bring in what you want to say and have not said so far. We start with you, Mahlet, again. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think just from the first question, if I understood you correctly with regards to the central banks and to what extent has been discussion in the country, right? So I think when you say the central banks, meaning from abroad or in the countries itself? Okay. So yeah, so I think the good thing, because like I mentioned also earlier, climate change is now mainstreamed in the country's development plans, and the country is also allocating its national resources to undertake some of these activities or initiatives, and in that meaning from the national budget, there is an allocation for climate activities, and the Minister of Finance itself is also looking at what is the expenditure, all the climate expenditure in the country, to see how much of the domestic finance is actually allocated for climate actions. And in the NDC, like the new Nationally Determined Contribution Plan, the government also plans to finance 20% of that nationally, meaning from the domestic sources, so meaning like the central bank or others, meaning from the national pot of money that it has. And I think your question, yes, with regards to China, yes, China is very active in the country, and there are many investments from the China government, and you can see the railroads and other like big projects are also funded by China. But also my understanding is the government is not only limiting itself to access resources from China only, but also, like I mentioned, there are different, I showed in one of my slides, the different potential funders for this green plan. It could be the World Bank, the other multilateral financial institutions, and also donors. And many European countries were also very open and have been supporting the country and undertaking, even starting from the design and also the pilot projects and also implementing the project. I think the other question is whether there has been a shift with the industrial policies since the new government. So, for example, the green industrialization strategy was launched in 2019. I believe work has been done before, and while after the Prime Minister came to power, so the greening of the industrial parks, the roadmap was also launched in 2020. So it's not business as usual, but also things are also progressing. So acknowledging that this has been a work in progress and, continuing. I think those are, And I think one last thing I would like to say is also maybe for the previous question, whether for an LDC country, if it makes sense to go green. But I think what we have presented today, and also what Valentine has told us about Rwanda, Kenya, Nigeria, and all others, is like it's possible, but also at the same time it really requires a lot of resources, and these resources cannot be mobilized only from domestic sources, and especially for smaller countries, it's really highly dependent from international sources. So I think for those big countries and big donors, it's very important that they see that these countries have the potential to reduce. And also we have to think, like Nafkote said it earlier, we have to think about the future generation. Maybe an African country today is emitting very less amount of carbon, but in the next 20, 30 years, it may be a highest emitting country, maybe as compared to some European countries. So in order to avoid that, we have to focus on the work now so that we don't follow that path. Thank you.
Yeah, unfortunately, we lost Valentine, but maybe we can ask him for a statement on the issue you raised, which is really important and included in the report, which will be published on the VIDC website. Maybe we can do it in this way. So it's your turn, Nafkote, and you will be the last speaker of today's evening.
Thanks so much. The central bank's question, I'm really sorry, I don't know much about it. I would love to talk to you after this panel, or I would love to hear from you here. The climate finance question, I think, the unequal power dynamics that also exists within, the climate negotiations. I can't give you a specific example, but for instance, to access climate finance just from the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, and I think the Green Climate Fund only accounts to maybe 2-3, maximum 4% of the overall climate finance. So it's not even, that big of a player when you see, that they only account to 3%, let's say on average. Who access, climate finance from GCF? Of course, countries can access, but a lot of developing countries may not have the technical capacity, or it's a very technical process. So it will be, like the World Bank or UN FAO and so on, and then giving it back to these countries. Or when it comes to, what you want these countries to implement, a lot of the times what developing countries complain about is we want finance for adaptation because we're hugely impacted, by the crisis in terms of they don't have the finance to adapt, or when a crisis happens, they don't have the finance to help their communities, rebuild. So they need finance for adaptation. But a lot of the times, the donors are giving them the money, or they're able to access the money mostly for mitigation. Of course, like GCF is trying to find a balance on this. So you can see there's a skewed, towards mitigation. They want these countries to transition to low carbon economy. But again, these countries do not contribute a lot to global emissions, yeah? So what they need is a lot of the times finance for adaptation, and they're not getting that. And last, like sometimes you see in climate negotiations, I'm not gonna mention names, but like at COP26, for instance, when developing countries were pushing for, we want finance for loss and damage, some rich countries, because they're donor countries, are telling them, hey, if you don't pull out of this negotiation, then you'll miss, the other bilateral finance, yeah? Like that they might be getting, I don't know, for food security or something. So the unequal power dynamics that we see in the world is also displayed within the climate negotiations.
Yeah. Thank you, Nafkote. Well, this is a very realistic statement at the end, I would say, and we will see if the African group of negotiators will push again this demand for, to be compensated for loss and damages in the next negotiations or rounds or summits. Yeah. We are at the end. Thank you for your patience. It's 8 o'clock sharp, so let me ask you again to fill in the feedback form, which you can find on your seats. And I'd like to draw your attention to the next VIDC event, which is called Capital and Counter-Revolution. And it will explore the question of what role countries such as Saudi Arabia or the Emirates or Qatar play in the financial architecture of global capitalism. It will take place at the 2nd of June. Remember, 2nd of June, at the same place. It will be here in this room. So let me say thank you again. We are living not in post-COVID times, but in COVID times still. As far as the buffet and the drinks are concerned, there is unfortunately no buffet for us, but we are invited to stay a little bit longer, and you might get in contact with our panelists. And let me say goodbye to Valentine. He did a great job, and we will ask him for a written statement that can be published. So let's wave goodbye to Valentine. Maybe he can see that. And thank you very much for being here and joining the discussion. Thank you very much.